Mm, 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 mm.
Here. I've been muted the whole time. I've been recording, but we've been muted. All right. Well, it's not great. There's gonna be a half hour of video that's just like stuff. Um, my bad, Gracie. Sorry. So it's okay. Monday for me too. Right? It's Monday for me too. All right. So here is what we're gonna do from a sort of next step for about the next half hour or so. All right. We're going to talk about changes in sort of the pulmonary side of things. Now I'm going to start this with a sort of a declarative statement on things, okay? And that's going to be this. I don't care about the pulmonary system. It's not very exciting. To me, other people study and do great things. It's not very exciting. It changes to some extent during exercise, but it, as long as you have good and normal pulmonary function, which most people that are y'all's age do, it doesn't limit exercise, which may be a little backwards and seem like that's not going to be the case. If you have asthma, it matters. If you're an older adult and you have chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, right? It matters. If you have emphysema, it matters, right? It's going to be really, really, really interesting, or probably sad, if we figure out in 20 years that all of this vaping also causes emphysema, just like regular smoking does, and those kinds of things. When we get there. But we'll walk through a little bit of this, okay? This is probably my least favorite thing to cover, so I'll go relatively quickly. The kind of interesting thing, though, is going to be at the end of this, we're going to talk about O2 and CO2 carrying capacity, which is really not a breathing issue, it's more of a blood issue. We'll talk about how we can use breathing to regulate acid-base balance through a thing called isocapnic buffering, and from there. Okay. Okay, wait. What? I don't understand. Why? Nope. It changes here, but not there. All right, that's cool. Okay. Let's see what's happening or not. Maybe. Okay. So we're going to try to learn what's respiration. Okay. What is respiration? I don't like the word respiration. We really need to talk about sort of ventilation in some of those ways. Different books call it different things. Technically, respiration is, in the most technical sense, is the use of oxygen in the mitochondria. Your mitochondria respire, your pulmonary system ventilates, it moves air. So we want to be careful about there. We'll talk about how do we breathe. We'll talk about gas exchange, and then where in some ways are we going to be able to carry and move O2 and CO2. Because that's some of the more interesting stuff that we've got that's going on there. Okay. All right. So let's talk about this idea or concept of breathing. Okay. Everybody hold your breath. You are clearly not following directions. Okay. We still good? We still good? How long can you hold your breath? All right, stop. Okay. Every one of you that actually held your breath to change your breathing rate and depth, right? You changed your ventilation afterwards. Okay. So, how often do you think about breathing? Ever?
A lot right now because of allergies.
A lot right now because of allergies. Okay. But in your everyday life, until I mentioned it right now, had any of you thought about breathing all day long? Have you thought about breathing yet? Jade's like, hell no. I don't think about breathing. I don't have time for that. Okay. Breathing ends up being like heart rate. Okay. We do it generally without ever thinking about it. It's controlled differently than heart rate, but we do it without thinking about it. If I tell you, you can overcome it. You can change, breathe faster, breathe slower, hold your breath. Unlike heart rate, you can voluntarily change it some. Okay. But it's a little bit different. So, the idea of breathing, from our standpoint, we're going to call it ventilation. Okay? We call it ventilation. That is going to, in a very big picture sense, help us understand getting oxygen in from the air into our lungs and then into blood and getting CO2 out. Okay? That big picture idea of breathing is very often called pulmonary ventilation. You guys will see we've got pulmonary diffusion, we've got pulmonary ventilation, we have other tissue diffusions. The terminology gets a little bit confused. Okay? To understand this, though, we have to understand why does air move and why do the gases in the air move in the way that they do. Okay? Why does air move from one place to another? Who thinks you know? Okay? Pressure changes. Very good. Okay? Pressure change. Okay? Air wants to move from high pressure to low pressure. Very simple. Okay? Gases in our air want to move from relative higher pressure to relative lower pressure. So when you breathe, and air moves in from out here in the atmosphere into your lungs, we are artificially creating a difference in air pressure from inside of our lungs to what's going on out here in the atmosphere. And when you breathe out, we're flipping that around. Okay? We are changing the air pressure in your lungs to make it different from the atmosphere, and that will then allow us to be able to move the air in and out, in and out. Okay? So we'll go through the mechanics of that, like how that happens, why that happens in a minute. Okay? All right. So in this overall process of breathing and moving gas in, we have a concept of what is generally just simply called minute ventilation. This is abbreviated as big V subscript capital E. Okay? That's ventilation. Ventilation is the pulmonary analog to cardiac output. Okay? Ventilation is how much air moves with each breath multiplied by the number of breaths you take in a minute. Okay? That's ventilation. So it's what the product of what we call tidal volume, which is air that moves in each breath multiplied by breathing frequency. Okay? Very, very kind of analogous to what happens with cardiac activity. We then, once we've sort of moved the air, we have an idea of what's called pulmonary diffusion, which is going to happen in the lungs, inside the alveoli, and it's going to be the exchange of oxygen and CO2 between alveolar gas or alveolar air and the blood in the capillaries. We then, and I know this is going to seem backwards, right? We're then going to transport that oxygen and CO2 from the lungs out to our tissues, or from the tissues back to the lungs. That's primarily going to involve hemoglobin, red blood cells, and dissolving things in the blood. I always think this seems backwards. This should be a cardiovascular, right, component of things, but we always talk about it for whatever reason as part of the pulmonary side. And then there is internal respiration, okay, which is going to be the exchange of O2 and CO2 between the blood and cells, and then the use of that O2 inside of those cells. So we bring air in and out, we diffuse or exchange the gases in that air and the blood in the lungs. We then use the cardiovascular system to move those gases out to a tissue or back from the tissue. And then we have the actual exchange of those gases from blood into the tissue of choice. It's going to be here. All of this is actually considered part of pulmonary ventilation, part of the sort of pulmonary function system, even though other than the top part, it doesn't actually involve the lungs. Okay. So if we're going to look at this respiratory or pulmonary system, we've got lungs, alveoli, and what are called pulmonary capillaries. This is all of the anatomy that I want you guys to know. Okay? I assume in y'all's anatomy class, you can figure out there's bronchioles, and they branch, and there's a zone in there called the conducting zone, where we don't actually do any gas exchange and all that kind of stuff. That's great. I'm glad if you guys know all of that and you understand that. But for our purposes, all I really want you to know and be able to give back to me is lungs, alveoli, and then the pulmonary capillaries that surround those alveoli. Why do we have alveoli? Listen. Maximize surface area. Okay. Without alveoli, I don't know how big your lungs are, but they're not very big. With the alveoli, most of you have like half a tennis court of surface area in your lungs. Okay. I still don't understand that. I like your lungs are like right here. Like, how do you have half a tennis court? Okay. Also, like 20 feet of small intestine are squished around inside of me. You didn't totally understand that one either. But that's the truth, okay? So in many ways, what we are doing is we're maximizing surface area. Okay. So let's talk about how we use the lungs and how we change kind of the shape and the pressure in the lungs to be able to breathe or move air in and move air out. Okay. So the process of moving air in is called inspiration. The process of moving air out is called expiration. Okay. Or inhalation and exhalation. When we bring air in, okay, it's generally an active process. And by active, I mean we have to contract a muscle. Okay. We have to contract the muscle. Exhaling, especially at rest, is passive. All you do is relax and the air just gets pushed out. Okay. So what we're going to do when we inspire is contract the diaphragm and maybe the external intercostal muscle if we're going to do some kind of forced, sort of large capacity breathing. Okay. When you contract the diaphragm, it sits here, you contract it and it falls. It goes down. Okay. As it falls, the volume inside the chest cavity, the volume of the place around the lung gets bigger. Okay. As the volume gets bigger, air pressure drops. Okay. Air pressure drops. That makes air pressure inside the lungs less than air pressure out here in the atmosphere. So when you open your mouth and your nose, then air will want to move from higher pressure in the atmosphere down into your lungs. Okay. The pressure only has to drop a few millimeters of mercury for air to want to move. It doesn't have to fall very far. Now, during forced inhalation, everybody take as large and as deep and breathe in for the inhalation as you can. Okay, ready? 3, 2, 1. Okay. During forced inhalation like that, which is more sometimes what happens during very high intensity exercise, we may change the pressure 80 to 100 millimeters of mercury. We create this giant pressure difference. So air very much wants to come and rush inside. Okay. Now, during expiration, at rest, it's passive. All you do is I contract my diaphragm. You just relax the diaphragm, and it will squish the lungs in essence, making the pressure rise. It didn't change very much, but then you open your mouth and your nose again, and the air will want to get pushed out. Okay? And then we start the process over again. Now, during expiration, if you want, you can do a forced expiration. Okay? Anybody ever been tested for asthma? Do like the worst, the forced expiration test where you have to blow out as hard and fast and as long as you can, and you're just like, there's nothing left in here, dude. Like it's all gone. Like 30 seconds of life. Like at some point, you're like, there's no more. Okay. When I do that, okay, it's not passive. Okay, it's not passive. So during high intensity exercise, when I can do forced expiration, I can again forcibly shrink the volume inside my chest cavity and force out even more air. Okay. So that's kind of how this is gonna operate, how this is gonna move. So this is an illustration of that. You can see the position of the diaphragm, right? Here's rest, there's inspiration, there's expiration, as the diaphragm moves up and down. And then the relative sort of concentration of the dots is just representing air pressure, right? So at rest, air pressure is essentially equal, right? You're not breathing in or out. Air pressure is equal between the atmosphere and your lungs. When you start to breathe in, we lower air pressure inside, higher outside it wants to move in until it equilibrates. And then when we want to do expiration, we relax, we raise pressure inside, it's higher here than it is outside, so air wants to move out until it equilibrates. Okay? That's how that works. All right. Now, I'm going to list these things, but you guys don't have to know. Okay. I want to introduce this as a concept. Anybody in exercise testing and prescription right now at the same time? Have you guys done the spirometry stuff yet in testing and prescription? No. Okay. You guys, it should be on the syllabus. Y'all will do it, I think. Okay. And so these are all measures, okay, that we can take by having you sort of breathe in and out, forcibly in, forcibly out on a device called a spirometer, so that we can measure the function of your lungs and your pulmonary system. Okay? When you go to get tested for asthma or COPD or something, they will do tests like all of this. So I just want to show you guys these things so that when you see them the next time when it really matters, it's not in some ways the first time. But what you're going to see is total lung capacity, okay, is the entire amount of air that can be contained in all of the passages inside your lungs. Okay, it is lung volume at maximal inhalation. That is total lung capacity. At rest, you don't usually use all of that capacity. You have some reserve for those kinds of things. Okay, vital capacity in some ways is the exact opposite. It's the largest amount of air that can be exhaled. Why is it called vital? I don't have a fucking clue. Okay, on these things, but these are kind of the most in, the most out that we can have, right? Residual volume is there's going to be some air. You cannot force all of their air out of your lungs. If you did, they would collapse on themselves, and that would be bad. So residual volume is how much air is left in after a maximal exhalation. Okay. If you have some sort of pulmonary pathology where exhalation is a problem, then your vital capacity is going to shrink. And your residual volume is likely going to stay elevated. Okay, that would tell us that your problem is with exhaling, not so much with inhaling. Okay, inspiratory capacity, right, is maximum volume of air inspired following what we would call a tidal expiration. So it's a normal exhalation, just okay, in that way. Functional residual capacity is the volume in the air in your lungs after a regular breath out, right? And you've got inspiratory and expiratory reserve volumes, which is again how much is normally in there after a regular breath. The only time these things matter, again, is if you have a problem. If you have alveoli that don't work right, okay? If you have some sort of obstructive or restrictive disease in the lungs that prevents you from changing the air pressure in there correctly, then these things can get messed up a little bit. Okay. You all don't have to know these. I'm not going to ask you a question about any of them beyond. You do need to know tidal volume because that's part of the ventilation, our ventilation equation. Okay. But this shows how these things are measured, right? You're just breathing along at rest. In, out, in, out, in, out, in, out, big in, okay, out, regular out, in, out, all the way out, okay, and then it's all in, all the way out. So you can figure out how these things look in comparison to each other, okay. All right. So let's look at some of these things. I find this to be sort of a really interesting and a really telling sort of thing. Okay. This is why, to me, this is not the most, not the world's most interesting sort of area to do research on and to study. Here are, okay, measures of sort of pulmonary function from our spirometry test in runners and in untrained control subjects that are basically the same age and the same size, okay? And I want you to look at this. Just look at this. This is the difference between our runners and our controls. Every one of these, except for, which one is this? Right? Other than sort of ventilatory volume, they're all basically identical. Okay? People that are highly trained and people that are the same size are essentially identical in their pulmonary function. You can bring any same amount of air, force out the same amount of air. Okay, so doesn't really play a particularly big difference in why somebody's a good runner or not. As long as you have normal function, this part of your system, at least the breathing part of it, is really never going to be a limiting factor. Okay. If I raise your VO2 max right now, I give you another liter of blood. Right now, your VO2 max goes up right now. Okay. Every one of you can raise your maximal ability to ventilate right now, which tells us what? If I make some other physiology go up and your maximal capacity to breathe goes up, what it tells us is you're not at your maximal capacity under normal circumstances. All of you can breathe more, okay, or to a larger extent than the rest of your physiology will allow you to right now. Okay? It only really matters when there's a problem. And I will, that's why I find it to be not particularly interesting. Okay. Don't worry about this. Again, I just kind of want to show you guys a little bit of how we approach and how we look at these things. Okay. You've got total ventilation, you've got tidal volume, right? You can see those kinds of numbers. And we've got air that's moving in, and it's how much total air moves versus how much ends up in the alveoli. So about, right, 7.5 liters, and only about 5 makes it. So there's some air that does not make it into there, okay? And so then there's alveolar air that moves, there's a certain amount of gas that stays in the alveoli, and then here's going to be your pulmonary capillaries with a certain amount of blood flow that's going through there. So if we understand this, right, if we raise these sorts of things on this side, this part goes up, alveolar gas goes up, gradient between alveolar gas and the capillary gets bigger, so we want to drive more air or more oxygen, especially out of the alveoli into the capillary. Okay, so this is just how people draw and sort of walk through what this is going to look like. Okay, more math. And there's going to be a really simple takeaway from all of this that I want you guys to say. Okay? And it will become apparent when we start talking about the relative differences in concentration in oxygen and CO2. If I want to try and calculate and understand the extent to which things will move and diffuse through a tissue, okay, I need to know the thickness of that tissue, the area or the surface area of that tissue, and then the difference in pressure from one side of the tissue to the other side of the tissue. Okay. And so if we do all of this, the other piece that matters, in addition to kind of these anatomical things, is a concept of what we call solubility. Okay. CO2 is very soluble in water. Okay. Very soluble, which means it will move much easier in water than oxygen. Okay. So for any surface area, for any sort of difference in pressure that we have, because CO2 is more soluble in water, CO2 will move much easier or to a much greater extent. O2 is much less soluble. You cannot dissolve oxygen in water very little at all. That's why all has to be carried under. Okay. And so because of this, which you guys will see, probably not today, but when we get into things, I guess it will be Wednesday, is that the sort of differences in pressure from in the capillaries into alveolar air for CO2 is very small, and yet it moves really quickly and really well. The difference in pressure for O2 is much bigger, okay? And it has to be that big because it's less soluble in water, otherwise it will not be moved. Okay. And so this is why extra CO2 is not really a problem for us. But if we get into a situation where if we go to altitude or you have an impairment in your red blood cells, okay, such that we shrink that gradient between air and capillary blood for oxygen, then our ability to diffuse is going to be dramatically impacted. Okay, dramatically impacted. Okay. There's some structures, right? You guys remember the conducting zone and the respiratory zone, right? The conducting zone is this sort of top, 60% or so from the trachea right into the primary bronchioles. It's going to branch, it's going to branch. We're not going to do a lot of actual diffusion or in what we call the respiratory zone until we get way down in the bronchiolar tree. Things branch out and make all of those alveoli. Okay. Now, I do need to mention this because this is important. It was pointed out on one of the slides earlier. We'll try to get to this a little bit more so. Okay. And again, this will matter when you see kind of the changes in O2 and CO2 pressures within the state. We have two types of ventilation. Okay. We have to add them together to get total ventilation. But there's what we call anatomical dead space ventilation, or in essence, conducting zone ventilation. And then we have alveolar ventilation. So as I said, not all of the air you breathe in makes it to the alveoli. Okay? And then not all of the air that you breathe out came from the alveoli. So there's going to be some level of inefficiency in the midst of this. And so if not all of the air makes it into the alveoli, that means that not all of the oxygen that we're taking in has a chance to get into the alveoli where it can diffuse. Okay. Now, in a lot of instances, this doesn't matter very much because we just kind of throw away dead space ventilation. We assume it's relatively constant all the time. It's not, but we assume that it's relatively constant, and we just simply focus on what's actually making it to the alveoli. Okay. So part of each breath remains in the conducting zone, doesn't reach it there. That's called anatomical dead space. Okay. It's called anatomical dead space. So we need to account for that, but we really care about, from a ventilation standpoint, from how we calculate oxygen consumption and things, what makes it into the alveoli. Okay. We'll do maybe one or two more slides, and then we'll go ahead and take our quiz. What you see here is called the respiratory membrane. The place in the alveoli where the outside layer of the alveoli makes contact with a pulmonary capillary, right, which is basically a single cell layer on the outside of the alveoli and a single cell layer that is the outside of the capillary, or that is the capillary wall, is collectively termed the respiratory membrane. Okay? From a pulmonary diffusion standpoint, from a movement of O2 and CO2 in the lungs, this is the place where all the action happens. It's at the respiratory membrane. So you have this layer right here. So we have generally higher oxygen inside the alveoli than is what is on hemoglobin in the red blood cells and capillaries. So O2 wants to go from the air onto hemoglobin. We have relatively higher CO2 concentrations in the blood, some on hemoglobin, some just dissolved in the plasma, because CO2 dissolves really well in there. So it wants to move from the blood out into the alveoli so it can then be exhaled. Okay. The total amount of respiratory membrane that you have is going to play a big role in determining pulmonary function. Okay. Most pulmonary disorders either have an impairment and you have alveoli that don't work, so therefore your total amount of respiratory membrane falls, or you have some sort of a breathing issue, and so you can't move the air in and out of the alveoli, so you functionally have respiratory membrane can't get enough air in it to actually set up the gradients correctly. All right. This is the whole reason we have alveoli, the whole reason we have all of these capillaries that are going to be in there, because that place where they touch is where all of this gas exchange is going to occur. Okay. All right. So here's just an electron micrograph of what this looks like. Okay. Capillary, alveoli, respiratory membrane, right here. So you want it to be small and very thin, so it's easy to move, or easier to move those gases. They don't have to travel very far. They don't have to get through a large number of cells and those kinds of things. Here you can see, sort of, we've pulled back out, you can see an alveoli and all the little dots on there are capillaries. Here's one where we've blown it up in a little bit more, so I just think those pictures look really, really cool. So you guys can see relatively how much sort of capillary space or capillary area there is surrounding all of these alveoli. So if you've got half a tennis court of alveolar space, just imagine you've got that many capillaries around every alveoli. Imagine how much capillary space there is, right? As well as how much capillary area there is that surround those so that we can diffuse oxygen. And this is why we're really good at it, right? We have lots of area, there's a large capacity, a large place for all of this exchange to occur. Okay, we'll stop here. Your quiz should open in just a minute, okay?